Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. My name is Dr. Brian Rade, and I'm a naturopathic doctor. And today I'm joined by Dr. Greg Nigh. Dr. Nigh is another a fellow naturopathic doctor. And normally I do a little pre-intro recording, but ran into some crazy traffic today. And Dr. Nigh, or I'm going to call him Greg because we've decided to go first name basis here before we started the recording. He's been graciously waiting for me. So thank you so much for your patience today, Greg. And would you mind just thank you for joining me? And would you mind just telling folks about a little background about yourself, where you practice, and what you do in practice?
Yeah, sure. And I so appreciate the conversation. I'm glad you asked me to have this. So yeah, I am in Portland, Oregon at Immersion Health is the name of the clinic. And been doing uh well, I won't even go into that. So yeah, in Portland, Immersion Health, I have a focus on oncology. I have had that focus for about, I don't know, 15 years or so. I still do, the other mold and Lyme and autoimmune and all that stuff that naturopaths see, but probably 60-70% of my patients are cancer patients. So that's a main focus. And then, yeah, I've got this other side thing about sulfur and research into that. I know we're going to talk more. And so that's a whole other kind of a set of patients that is also working with.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. And yeah, I mean, I have a fairly significant portion of my practice is oncology as well, although probably flip the other percentage wise, maybe it's 25 to 30% oncology, the rest of it's complex chronic illness. So we're kind of like a yin yang thing here. But anyways, but
Yeah.
I don't know about you, and I'd be curious to know. I found that the more that I learn about complex chronic illness and like the deep dive into all the physiology and pathophys that you need to really help those folks as much as possible. Like I learned things that translate into the oncology realm of my practice and then vice versa as well to some extent. And I'm just wondering, could you speak to your experience with how, one sort of side of your practice kind of informs the other, like the oncology versus the non-oncology? Is there an interplay there or not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, it's like in the conventional world how there's like the gastroenterologist and the pulmonologist and of course we think that's ridiculous because it's all just part of the same package, like it's you can't divide them out like that. In many ways, I kind of think illness is the same way. It's like, we do have, oh, we'll see that person for Lyme and that person for mold and that person for cancer. But they all have so many underlying commonalities to them in terms of immune, and not that, of course, they have distinctions as well, in the same way that breast cancer is distinct from gallbladder cancer. Like they're not necessarily the same, but they have lots of commonality. And in the naturopathic world, especially when it comes to cancer, it's like, I mean, I just make up numbers on this, but so with two different kinds of cancer, breast cancer, gallbladder, there are 80% of what those cells are doing is similar. And then 20% are okay, well, there's different flags on their surfaces and they got some other things that are different between them. And in the conventional world, they focus on the 20%. And that's why there's like a bazillion different protocols depending on all the sub types of cancer, because they're looking at the minutia that is unique about each cell. Whereas I think of what I do, and I think it's probably generally true, is that in cancer treatment, I'm largely focusing on the 80% that is similar among all cancer types, which are metabolic uh, things that those cells are up to. So I said all that because now, if we go back over to kind of the rest of disease, it's like, sure, there are things that are unique uh, from one kind of disease type to another, from mold over to Lyme and whatever. And so you do have to address the uniqueness. And at the same time, there is so much that is common between them. And kind of how immune systems get kind of shuffled around, and absolutely that, I mean, these things then, if you look over at what a cancer cell is doing, there is much that is in common in what's happening there and how they're generating their energy and trafficking various types of molecules and whatever. So yes, everything informs everything. I mean, which is true of just kind of general biology and true of then how we think about how how do you how do you right this imbalance that's in place. So yeah, that was kind of a windy answer, but mhm.
Here to hear how your brain works. So that's windy away. But would you maybe give an example of actually? But sorry, let me start the question again here. One of the things, and I'm trying to remember now. I think. So I remember the first time I saw you speak was at an Onc-AMP lecture. For folks listening, that's the Oncology Association of Naturopathic Physicians. They have a wonderful annual conference, and I saw you speak many years ago. This was prior to that, the sulfur talk. This was like years before that. We didn't actually chat at that time. It's like, oh man, this guy is really, really smart. And I'm trying to remember now. I remember you were talking about like, anyways, dosing folks like at pretty high dosages for different things at the time. But I can't remember if you were talking a lot about mitochondrial support at that time or not. I think maybe Dr. Seyfried's book had like Thomas Seyfried's book had just come out around that time. I think so. This is quite a while ago. But anyways, regardless of the background, would you
Yeah.
be able to speak to sort of the importance of addressing mitochondrial function slash dysfunction in kind of an oncology case versus a, say a non-oncology, like a Lyme mold type case? Would you maybe just kind of freestyle on that a little bit? And then maybe I'll ask some more nuanced questions about it, but just wondering what your thoughts are around that.
Well, yeah, I would. I mean, it's like if you drill down on any pathology, any, if you go far enough, you're gonna find mitochondria not working right.
Hmm.
Like it's like the basic common denominator for everything. And uh it's how you get a mitochondria doing what it's supposed to do differs between somebody with, say, mold toxicity and somebody with cancer, but you can't not address mitochondria. It's like, so anyway, so yes, I mean, that has early on with the cancer thing seemed like the gold. Like they're not making energy the way other cells do. That's just a fundamental thing. Um, and so yeah, I that becomes a central thing that I'm thinking about in putting together any kind of a cancer treatment program. So methylene blue is something that I have kind of gotten tuned into like maybe 2 years ago and have seen. I mean, that has made a major difference in some particular people, because that's what it's a mitochondria therapy. I mean, it does other things that are also valuable, but what it is doing in the mitochondria, there's really nothing else that can do that. And then there are various other tools in the cancer setting with lipoic acid and DCA, and I mean all kinds of ways that you're looking at getting those electrons moving down the chain and ATP and yada yada. Um, of course, uh, I think that now getting too deep in the weeds on this, but um, water and water structure is, in my mind, another. It's like everything ends up being the most fundamental thing, and so okay, well, mitochondria is, but also the structuring of water is, and in fact, the structuring of water inside the mitochondria is where it all comes together, because mitochondria are filled. The water inside the mitochondria didn't come from outside. It was made in the mitochondria, and it is deuterium depleted water. And the fact that it is that is extremely important for overall cell health. And that's where all of this kind of ties into sulfur, because sulfur compounds are what structure water to a large degree. There are some other molecules that play that role as well, but so there's this golden braid of sulfur physiology and mitochondria health and water structuring, and it's it, it's just sort of fun geeky stuff to always be trying to figure out what interventions can come into play here to allow these three to all be optimized, because whether you're dealing with cancer, you're dealing with mold or whatever, those three end up being pretty fundamental to whatever you're trying to do. I'm not even sure I answered your question on that, but yeah.
You're giving me useful information, and I'm fascinated by it. And it's exciting to hear you talk about it because like these are these kind of sometimes seemingly disparate concepts, but it's nice to hear them all kind of being the golden braid, as you say. Like I've never heard that one before, but yeah, braiding it all together, it's great. I mean, a bunch of like questions to ask you based on what you just said, but I guess maybe the first one would be like you mentioned, sulfur is one of the most important molecules to kind of get into the or to involved in optimal structuring of water. You mentioned there's a couple of other molecules, or I guess sulfur is an element, but other components that are required for that as well. What are those other components like along with sulfur that are so important for
Sure.
water structuring?
Yeah. Uh-huh. So what I'm about to say is all from Jerry Pollack. Dr. Jerry Pollack, he wrote The Fourth Phase of Water. He originally, the first book of his I read back in early 2000s was called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And it was like, holy crap, that was a whole new model of the cell. Now, it was all based on Gilbert Ling, and I had already read Gilbert Ling, but Jerry Gilbert is impenetrable. You can't, nobody can understand anything that guy writes, but I was fascinated by it anyway.
Hmm.
But then Jerry wrote that his book, which was basically kind of a readable version of Ling's work. Anyway, this is all history that you don't really need to know. But so he wrote that in 2001, I think. And then in 2000, whatever, 10 or 11, he wrote The Fourth Phase of Water. And so I read that, and it was another like, oh my gosh, an entirely new understanding of water and how it structures. Now, he was not working with biology so much. He's just in a lab and using, and so the key is water naturally forms a structured layer whenever it bumps up against an electronegative surface. So negative charge surface, and it will do it. You don't have to input any energy. It just forms a structured layer. And that structured layer is unique. It's fourth phase, solid, liquid, gas, and that. And as that layer forms, hydrogens start getting shared. So you have oxygen and hydrogen, hydrogen. And so I've got my two hydrogens and that one a hydrogen. And so my right arm is sharing this hydrogen with that oxygen over there. So you end up not needing as many hydrogens when you form these rings. They're rings of 6 molecules of water. So you have excess hydrogens that then leave the structured area, and they go to what's called the boundary layer, which is right outside of where the structured layer ends, is where the bulk water is, or what we think of water as being, the non-structured water. So now we've got a layer of hydrogens that accumulate right here. And this layer is negatively charged because it lost a bunch of hydrogens. So what happens when you separate charge? It's a battery. So now we have negative charge here, positive charge here, and Jerry and others have shown that this is a functional battery in all of us. The structuring of our water separates charge and is a constant source of energy, as that battery is constantly in flux. And so there are anything that thickens the layer of water is essentially strengthening our battery. And so the answer to the question that you asked me is that anything with a negative charge, so proteins generally are negatively charged. In fact, pretty much everything in the body, sialic acid on the surface of cells, but the largest supplier of that negative charge are the heparan sulfate glycosaminoglycans, because they are this forest on the surface of every cell, and lining all the surfaces, supplying this just huge expanse of negative charge on everything. And water then confronts that negative charge, builds that structured layer, develops the battery. This is happening inside cells, happening outside cells, happening throughout our connective tissue, which is full of negative charge. So it's this constant structuring of water that is happening throughout the body, with sulfur being the primary, and particularly heparan sulfate, which is the most densely negative charged molecule in all of biology. It's a huge amount of negative charge on each. It's essentially a repeatable unit, but each unit has eight, I believe it's eight, more than eight negative charges associated with it. So it's it's very amenable to providing that structure into the water. And if anybody's interested in the geeky details, Stephanie Seneff and I wrote a paper on this, which was published in Jerry's journal, which is called Water, oddly enough.
Mhm.
And that was back, I think we published that in 2018 or 19, something like that. But we get into the details about exactly how these sulfur molecules are providing that structuring and the importance of charge and yada, yada, yada. I mean, Stephanie's brilliant in how she can unravel topics. So it's kind of a fun paper to write.
It's amazing. Yeah, I mean, she's an incredibly smart cookie. Like, for folks who are not familiar, if memory serves, PhD at MIT, and yeah, just leading expert in glyphosate and other things too, I'm sure, but sulfur as well, evidently. And yeah,
Yeah.
very, very smart cookie. So, in good company there. I'm just wondering, and I'm not sure if you see this in your sort of non-oncology practice or oncology practice, but I'm just, hearing you talking about how like, connective tissue being, a very rich source of negatively charged molecules. Any thoughts around like the link between folks with hypermobility, which I don't know if it's on the rise or not, or people are just recognizing it more, but there just seems to be, some more hypermobility challenges. If so, is there any relevance there with, say, sulfur deficiency or issues with not having as much structured water? Are folks kind of getting this like induced hypermobility? Maybe there's a little genetic predisposition, and then things like maybe a sulfur deficiency might be pushing them over the edge. Just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so those are really good questions. And I mean, I can tell you, so I've been in practice, what is it, 22 years now. For the first, at least 10 years, probably a little longer than that, I had never heard of Ehlers-Danlos.
Hmm.
Not a single patient ever showed up with Ehlers-Danlos. And then it's like, then the first one, and I'm like, oh, that's weird. What's that? And and then it became a thing. Like, I mean, it's not like they fled my practice, but now, I've seen at least a couple of dozen EDS patients over the past decade, which, I mean, it was something happened. And, there's said to be these genetic underlying predispositions. Well, I don't know what those genes were doing for my first 10 years in practice, but they all woke up somehow. So, yes, I think, in looking at what's going on with connective tissue, something that I think is fundamental is glyphosate. And because um, glycine is a significant component of connective tissue. And I think Stephanie and a few others have shown pretty conclusively that glyphosine glyphosate will substitute for glycine in the body, um, wherever that is. And in fact, was Samsel, I forget his first name. He's written some papers with Stephanie, but he showed, well, I mean, again, I'm going on a tangent here, but he showed with his own study, he obtained pharmaceutical grade trypsin. And trypsin is, it's a serine protease, and it is a molecule that has a hinge in the middle of it. And it only becomes active when that hinge allows it to do its hingy thing. Well, that hinge is a glycine. And he was able to show in pharmaceutical grade trypsin some large, there was a large amount of glyphosate in that sample, that it was not a contaminant. It was built into the molecules, and
Hmm.
very likely that at least some of those hinges got unhinged, which has big implications for all of us who are relying on trypsin to do our digesting and all that kind of stuff. But then when you ricochet around all the places where glycine and glutathione and connective tissue, and I mean, it is so kind of big when you think about the implications of replacing those glycines. And I mean, there's some hormones have, so, one of the measures for how important a given amino acid is within in a particular molecular structure is to look at how highly conserved it is. Meaning you look at other species that have the same or similar kind of a hormone, and how often do you find that amino acid in that position down a lineage. And so the ones that are highly conserved, it's telling you you can't change that one because it'll mess things up. And there were, I mean, in a couple of papers that we've written have talked about some of the different hormones that are very important for brain function and lots of things have glycines that are highly conserved. You can't replace the glycine, even with alanine, which is a very, very similar molecular structure. But if you put an alanine there, it shuts down the function. And so we have lots of these critical glycines, and we have glyphosate that is ubiquitous. All of us, even those of us eating predominantly organic food, we all have glyphosate in us. And studies show that. And so what are the implications for things like connective tissue integrity, where you've got just lots and lots of glycine? Or, I mean, there are just so many possible ramifications for what we've done. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. So.
You did, and then some. So we're good. And I'm wondering, kind of in the same veins, I do have a few other kind of big topics I want to talk to you about as well, but maybe just a quick kind of sub question to that. Just bearing in mind how important
I don't
connect.
I don't really do quick, by
Okay,
the way.
touche. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll try anyways. It's all good. Um, we'll roll with the punches. Just where connective tissue is such a significant component of our endothelial system as well, like our with our blood vessels, and just where in addition to say hypermobility syndromes like Ehlers-Danlos, being I think on the rise. I mean, again, my majority of my practice is complex chronic illness, so I've definitely seen a huge bloom as well. I've only been at it for 15 years, but like my first 5 years, like didn't really see a whole lot. It's just been more and more in the last 10. But I've also seen a huge rise in like POTS and other types of like vascular dysautonomias. And so just I make the assumption that there's probably a link there too, maybe whether it's just from the connective tissue side of it, or maybe I'm sure there's other factors too, but just wondering if you have any additional thoughts around the, yeah, maybe rise or prevalence of conditions like POTS or other vascular dysautonomias, if that might relate to the connective tissue side of things, or maybe other things that you're aware of.
Gosh, yeah. Um, I mean, there has been, in my observation, this astounding rise in the amount of dysautonomia in general that is manifest in many ways. I mean, POTS being kind of the archetypal
Mhm.
manifestation of it, but I mean, it has been really shocking. And in fact, Neil Nathan just came out with a book. I forget what it's called, but it's basically about hypersensitivity, which is like, I mean, you must be seeing this too. There are patients who are, I mean, it is crazy how reactive they have become to their environment.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, it's just unbelievable. It's like you can't do a therapy because anything you try, if you even like whisper the word of the therapy, it's like
I know.
will induce hives or something
Mhm.
on people.
Yep.
So it's like, where do we look for the cause of this dysregulation? And I think it's like at this point we're like the fish trying to find the water because it's all around us. I know when 5G went in, um, when they flipped that switch on, which in Portland, it's everywhere. I mean, its city is saturated. Right outside this window behind me is a 5G corridor. Um, I think there was a major like click up in the number of people who were coming in with those kinds of reports. I think there was a huge amount around with COVID. I mean, many aspects of what happened, what transpired with COVID were were I mean, just a wreck for our autonomic regulation. Um, and then, glyphosate. I I mean, I think having just read, I don't know if you did you ever read The Invisible Rainbow?
No, I've heard of it, but I have not read it.
I mean, it's one of those where I mean, had always been sort of oriented toward, oh, Wi-Fi, 5G, that's all bad. It's going to be really bad for our health. That book meticulously documents going all the way back to the introduction of electricity back in 1849 or something, I don't know. But the first time they started running electricity through a wire, people started getting sick from it.
Really?
And
Wow.
conditions that were essentially never documented became part of the document. Tremors essentially didn't exist prior to electricity coming around.
Wow.
Headaches, fatigue, anxiety, panic. I mean, they were in the medical literature, but very rarely reported. And
Hmm.
then who's reporting them? Oh, the people working like switchboards and
Right.
people in were. So anyway, big tangent. But the point is, we're now deep at the bottom of an ocean of electromagnetics. I mean, I have a thing. I mean, a lot of people have them. I mean, I can walk around this apartment. I can stand still in the apartment, and it is constantly fluxing up to screaming, and then it comes down, and then it's back up. It's constant. We're in this, and it is impossible that this is having no impact on our autonomic nervous system. And so yeah, I it's like how do we even think about therapies in the context of this barrage of um, dysregulating stuff? It's I mean, it's a challenge. It's not like I got it figured out in any way. I mean, there are certainly a set of therapies that I find to be quite valuable for lots of people. Some people, I mean, one of the few nutrients, it's like, things that you give patients, in my, just simplistic way of thinking about things, they kind of fall into two categories. There's like the majority of things, which is like probiotics. You give somebody probiotics, it's probably not going to happen that you follow up them in 2 weeks and they say, "Oh my God, that changed my life."
Hmm.
You just do it because it's good. You need
Hmm.
to, okay, help the bugs. And then there's this limited number of things that you give to somebody, and not every time you give it, maybe only 10% of the time, but they come back and they say, "That changed my life." It is some big thing. So I say all that because one of the things, and I suspect that you have at least witnessed this in somebody, is giving a high dose of the vitamin B1, and especially um, kind of the complex. I use one that has 4 different forms of the B vitamin,
Hmm.
but given that B1 is sort of the top domino or the top nutrient that is needed for autonomic regulation, there are some people who have been highly reactive, either environment or foods. You give them a nice big dose of vitamin B1 and that contains the different forms. Holy crap, changes their life. Like they calm down and they're not as reactive. And it's lovely when it's that easy, that it's just, oh, one vitamin, and other things. B12 is another that I would put in that category, that when you get that into somebody who needs it, it will change their life. Like it will be like a battery comes back on and suddenly they can think and they can function. You know, so I don't know, I'm just talking in loops here, but autonomic regulation seems to me the crux of essentially every treatment plan, because everyone's coming in with some level of dysregulation. And if that stays dysregulated, doesn't matter how good the rest of your treatment plan is. The body can't use it if it's just locked into a sympathetic overload or parasympathetic overload. So anyway, yeah, that's my quick answer.
There's different definitions of quick out there, I suppose. But no, this again, in all seriousness, I'm loving it, and I wish I could just talk to you for a few hours because I think this stream of consciousness. I'm loving
Yeah.
it. Um, as far as the autonomic nervous system regulation goes, like in outside of say B1 or B12, like are there certain kind of more go-to therapies that you have for autonomic nervous system regulation? Is it more like nutritional based, like, or like, vitamin and mineral based, or what are some of your go-tos of like, oh man, this person needs some autonomic nervous system regulation support? Like what are some of your go-tos there?
Yeah. So I would say probably the one I use most, and the one I have found the most valuable, is a system protocol called Safe and Sound Protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that one?
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Safe and Sound, based on the work of this brilliant guy, Stephen Porges. He's got lots of YouTubes if people want to listen to him talk. He's just kind of he's grandfatherly kind of guy. But he came up with this system called polyvagal theory, which there's a whole textbook on it. I find it fascinating. They're all just models for understanding why people are the way they are. But I think polyvagal works as a model for understanding lots of behaviors. And it's rooted in vagal nerve balance. So anyway, so he's got a compelling model. And in fact, there's a book called, I think it's Healing, what is it? The vagus nerve. I forget. Anyway, so Porges then came up with a therapy called Safe and Sound Protocol that is, you're just wearing over the ear headphones, and it's as though you're just hanging out listening to classical music. But somehow Porges figured out that if you filter that music of specific frequencies, it has this magic adjusting effect on the tone of the vagus nerve. And so over a series of session every day, you listen to this, I have had a number of people describe transformative experience. And it's often subtle, but people just realize over the course of doing this, they are more calm. They're not as reactive emotionally. They're not as reactive to their stuff, foods or whatever. Um, and so Safe and Sound is now central to most of my treatment plans. Whether it's mold or cancer, doesn't matter. There are other therapies. Before Safe and Sound came around, DNRS was an option, and that also has been life transforming for some people. It is very different than Safe and Sound. DNRS is a very active, you're moving and talking and, pushing things around. And that's, some people dig that style. For people that don't, Safe and Sound is great because you're just sitting and listening. It's a very much more passive process. But I still occasionally will recommend DNRS for the people that I can tell they're that kind of person. They want to
Mhm.
like be really engaged in the therapy. So those are things that I'm having people do regularly. Grounding, everybody's got to get outside and get their feet on the ground 20 minutes a day at least. Um, EFT, I have often, or yeah, I mean, I'll send out just a link to a video to teach people how to do EFT because can't get much cheaper as a therapy.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, those are Epsom salt baths. Oh my God, I have people doing, just a boatload of Epsom salt in a bath and soak for 20 minutes, and you're pretty hard to be in a sympathetic state when you get out of that bath. So yeah, those are some things I'm having
Okay.
people
Great.
do.
Great. And I'd just like to pick your brain about sulfur in a little more detail here. And just bearing in mind for folks listening, we're not giving any medical advice here. This is all for informational purposes only. So if you need healthcare advice, talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. I just want to ask you a little bit about sulfur supplementation. I
Sure.
know when we spoke many moons ago now at that one of the OnKMP conferences, you were talking at that time about the Epsom salt baths, and then you're also talking, I think at that time, if memory serves, you were just kind of just getting into the like oral dosing of like higher dose sulfur, I think. And I think you were talking about like chondroitin sulfate and glucosamine sulfate, and then I think maybe MSM as well. So I'm just wondering, when you want folks to get your patients to get more sulfur into their systems, what are the types of supplements you use? And are you, there's some folks that are using these really high dose sulfur protocols, like, higher dose MSM and things like that. So could you just speak to what kind of approach you're using for the sulfur replenishment?
Sure. And I mean, I am constantly learning. I mean, like we all are, we're
Mhm.
constantly learning better new ways of doing things. And, sulfur, it's, in my view, the problem is not that we need to get more sulfur in, but we need to get the body making more sulfate. And so there's a disconnect between the sulfur coming in and what it's getting used to make. And the reason people have their sulfur symptoms is that they're not making enough sulfate and they're making too much hydrogen sulfide and sulfite, because those are both very symptomatic if they're in excess. And so the the process that I'm working with people on, and of course I'm working with Maria, the nutrition therapist, who's also the one I send to for Safe and Sound protocol. Um, the process is to reduce sulfur intake for a short period of time while we supply various nutrients that can facilitate the body processing sulfur. And most people, within a couple of days into that, their symptoms start going away, whatever the symptom was, doesn't matter. And then at the end of that process, there's the reintroduction to find out if there are any highly reactive foods still, or because we want people, I don't like people to be on restrictive diets for too long. I want people eating a range of foods. Um, in terms of this supplementation that I'm doing with people, I find it's very interesting to me that some people with that are very sensitive to sulfur, they can take taurine, for example. Taurine has a sulfate attached to it. Others with a sulfur sensitivity cannot touch taurine. It causes their headaches or whatever it is. MSM, I think, is very interesting in that it's one that I forget the name of the practitioner who is now has this whole protocol where you're ramping up to 30 grams a day of MSM. And yesterday, literally yesterday, I got an email or a message from a patient who I had last seen last year doing, our sulfur work. And she, had gotten better, but it wasn't the home run case. She wrote, the subject was, I'm cured. And she was really excited to tell me that she did this MSM protocol and all of her symptoms, all of them are gone.
Wow. It's amazing.
Which is, I freaking love that. I'd love to hear that. And, it's like I need to look into that a little more because I mean, I know of multiple sulfur sensitive patients who tried MSM and it wrecked them. Um, so, but like, I mean, nothing works for everybody. It's like that's the friggin' torture of our business, like but it's one of those tools that I need to be thinking about more often, and exploring. So MSM, with chondroitin or glucosamine sulfate, MSM, those sulfur things, it's all like it's it's such a trial and error process with patients and finding out what works. Um, I mean, I do find if I get people on a high enough dose of molybdenum, specifically Mozyme Forte, no connection, just it's what works. Um, if I keep people dosed adequately on that, and in fact, one person who is symptom free but has to take 5 of those twice a day, which is
Wow.
crazy. I mean, you got to I'm not recommending that to anybody because you got to watch out some other nutrients that can get depleted and all of that. But when people do some regular, usually Mozyme becomes kind of like a multivitamin. They take it every day. Um, Epsom salt baths, if people do those regularly, which is a way of getting sulfate through the skin, doesn't have to go down the tube. So it's getting into the bloodstream directly. And from there, it can get turned into active PAPs, which is the active sulfate. So, yeah, does that answer your question
Yeah.
on the
No, that's
where I
beautiful.
stand?
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you. That's great. Um, So, Greg, I know we just have a few minutes left. I know we started late because of traffic here. So, just before we wrap things up, 'cause I certainly don't want you to be late for your next patient. Would you mind just letting folks know, like, do you work with folks long distance? Like, if folks are like, "Hey, Dr. Nye, I really want to, sounds like a good fit for me." Are you taking patients? And if so, do you work with folks long distance so they have to travel to Portland to work with you? Do you have any online offerings? For patients or clinicians for that matter that you can tell us about?
Well, yeah. So for people who just would like to hear more about sulfur and how it affects their health and all that, there's a big bunch of like talks that I've given, podcasts and talks that are available. If you just search my name and sulfur, you pretty much come up with a lot. So for that kind of general stuff, that's out there. I work with people all over the place. So anybody who would be interested in getting some more detailed and personalized stuff, absolutely, you can call the clinic. Um, and just if you go to the website, Immersion Health PDX, and can just set up an appointment. And yes, we do Zoomy stuff and can work that way. Do it all the time.
Great. And any social media that you're on, like Instagram or any of that craziness?
Ay. Uh, no, I mean, I put stuff on X, I guess it's now
I
Twitter.
think it's X now. Yeah, I don't know. I still call it
I
Twitter.
it's I mean, that's not really my doctor. I do some doctory stuff, but like it might be a little offensive to some people. So
Okay. Well, folks have been forewarned, but I'll put in the show notes, I'll put your clinic website and yeah, I
excellent.
guess that's the best way to get in touch with you. But awesome. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Craig. I
Yeah,
really
Brian,
appreciate it.
thanks
And
so much for having me on. I enjoyed it.
I'm so glad. Yeah, and hopefully we can do this again sometime because again, I could talk to you for hours. It's been wonderful. So thanks so much for your time, and thank you folks for tuning into this episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. Please stay tuned for the next one.